Hey, what's going on? Welcome to the Podcast Accelerator, the thrice-weekly show that brings you podcast education, industry insights, and straight-talking reactions to podcasting news. I'm your host, Mark Asquith, that British podcast guy and CEO and co-founder of Rebel Base Media, the podcast tech company based out of the UK that creates the Podcast Success Academy, podcast websites, productivity, Rebel Base Studios, and Captivate.fm. The world's only growth-oriented podcast host, where you can get your first month of podcast hosting for just $1 and transfer an existing podcast in completely for free. Now, today, we have a bonus episode. I'm digging deep. This is not in the normal mix of things. This is an extra bonus episode that I'm digging into Google's recent move into podcasting, in particular the search engine optimization potential that brings for us as podcasters. It's going to be a very interesting topic to talk to, and it's going to be very interesting for you to listen to. So I want you to dig into this if you are a podcaster, all right? But before I do that, I want to just give you a bit of a heads up that my great friends over at AWeber, Brandon, Chris, and the team over there are still giving you 90 days to try out AWeber. Now, AWeber is an email marketing platform that I integrate with everything that I do. In fact, just today, I've been working on a new kind of independent podcaster survey here at Rebel Base Media. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be very interesting. I identify some trends that we're all facing as independent podcasters, and of course I've been using AWeber to do that. So the reason that I choose AWeber is because they work like we do. They're very personable, they're very genuine, they're very honest people that are willing to let you succeed on your own terms. So email marketing for your podcast is vital. If you're not doing it, please go and check out AWeber at markasquith.com/AWeber. All right, very, very recently, Google have announced that they're doing a heck of a lot more in podcasting than we ever anticipated. Now, it's not unsurprising. So I was at Harvard University over in Boston, Massachusetts last year, speaking to podcasters at Harvard. I was educating on podcasting up at Harvard. I was very fortunate and very privileged to be asked to go and educate on podcasting at such a prestigious place. And joining me up there were a raft of podcasting experts, including Zack Reneau-Wedeen, who is the product lead over at Google Podcasts. Now, I've got a lot of time for Zack. I've met him several times. We have email conversations. He's a very, very stand-up guy, and he gave a lot of information about what Google's vision was for podcasting, which is essentially to double podcast listening, okay? And of course, they've got the Android ecosystem, which makes it very, very easy to see what that kind of base strategy would be. But the other thing that Google has got is that, of course, it's got the search engine. This is the biggest product that it owns. It's the biggest search engine in the world, has been forever now. And Google has now integrated, and this was something that Zack said as well at the RAIN Summit. Again, we were fortunate enough to go to the RAIN Summit in New York City, and Zack was there as well. I bumped into him in the gents, as inevitably I always seem to do, just bump into people in the gents. And we started having a good chat when we were digging into it. He was on stage as well, talking on a panel about what Google are up to. And he was saying that, look, search is vital. If you think about how search works, you know, people discover podcasts based on word of mouth. They find podcasts based on searching for things. And I think there's a very interesting opportunity here, because what Google is doing and what Zack's team are doing is they are using their transcription services to identify podcast content. So they're transcribing the podcast on the back end. They're not giving us the transcriptions to put on our websites, and you know, rightly so. I don't think we need that right now from Google. But what they're doing is they're using their machine learning to make podcast transcripts searchable so that Google can now serve up, theoretically, podcasts based on keywords. Now, flash forward a couple of months since we saw Zack at the RAIN Summit in New York City, and they rolled out what they said they were going to roll out, which is in search results, so in the SERPs, search engine results pages, in the SERPs, when you search for something, if you search for a podcast, not only do you get the website for the podcast, but you also get a nice little listing of the most recent episodes from that podcast and a play button to play directly in the search engines. Now, this is interesting for me because YouTube is one of the biggest search engine listening tools out there, and that kind of annoys a lot of podcasters, and in particular, some of the podcasting industry. But I kind of get this because iTunes, although it's I do believe Apple are doing something with podcasting this year. I think the ecosystem and the apps that we've got on the desktop from Apple will look very different by the end of 2019 than what they do now. iTunes right now is a little bit clunky. Spotify is nice. You can use Spotify to listen to podcasts on your desktop. It works. But I understand why YouTube is up there as well, because if I fire a tab up, what I can do is I can just listen to the Joe Rogan Experience in a passive tab over in my browser somewhere while I work on other stuff. So it's kind of a decent mechanism for listening to podcasts. I don't think it's a huge player, and I think there was some analysis out there recently which kind of bluffed it a little bit. There was a pretty faulty survey that was out there that said YouTube was the biggest aggregator of podcasts. That is the way the mechanisms, the methodology of that survey were wildly flawed. But I can understand if there is some truth to that. I can understand why. Because it's just passive. Now, if you think about Google and if you think about discoverability, we know that discoverability is a problem. I do believe Spotify will start to work on that problem because they're going to be doing a lot of recommended work alongside, okay, you've listened to Bruce Springsteen. Well, here are 5 podcasts about Bruce Springsteen, for example. That's a great recommendation engine. And they've been testing that. However, if you think about the way that we search for everything else, if I want to buy a new TV, I start on the long tail, what's called the long tail of search, where I'll search for what is the best TV of 2019. And the long tail of search, which is a very specific keyword, will take me to a list of results. And remember, what Google is trying to do here when I search for something is it's trying to give me, its business is to give me the most relevant and highest quality result for that query. And then once I've researched that, I might go back to Google and search for a more specific thing, such as what's the best LED TV? And then once I've done that, I'll go back to Google once I've researched it and say, actually, what's the best priced LED TV? And you kind of work it down and you become more specific every time you search. And I think this is interesting for podcasters because if you think about it, search engine optimization, SEO, as podcasters, we can kind of do a bit on YouTube. We can optimize our websites and so on and so forth. Our biggest search engine, though, are the podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the rest of the apps out there on the market. Google has just changed the game with this, all right? Because if Google gets to a point that we can essentially do deeper level SEO, so actual keyword research, and if it favors audio like it does, well, not necessarily favors, but if it puts a prominence on audio like it does on video, we have an opportunity as podcasters to do decent keyword research and become more strategic about our content. Now, that's not to say that we should just make bad content like a lot of bad websites do just to try and peek out the search results. We should not do that. Categorically, no. We are still high-quality content first. We're about the people, we're about the listeners. However, if we get data on that, there's nothing to say that we can't be wiser and more strategic with how we phrase certain things. So if I do want to find out what is the best TV of 2019, am I going to get served a podcast where that phrase is very often uttered? Hey guys, welcome to my TV podcast. Today we're going to talk about what is the best TV of 2019. And I say that 2 or 3 times in natural conversation. If Google are transcribing that podcast, it's not only the title and the descriptions that they're looking at the entire content like they do for blog posts. That gives us masses of opportunity as podcasters. It gives us a chance to actually compete with blogs and compete with YouTube, not only to podcast listeners, but to casual browsers who ordinarily wouldn't understand that a podcast could give them that information. It will give them also episode-level dialogue. Now, interestingly, what I think this could mean is that if you ever Googled anything and then a YouTube video has come up and said, okay, here's a 5-minute video about how to do this thing. But actually, we recommend that 1 minute 30 to 2 minutes 10 is the period that you should listen to, because that's where they talk about solving this problem that you've Googled. And if you click the video in the Google search results, it will take you to that time spot. It will take you to that time stamp in the video. I believe that Google will start to do that in the future, okay? Because why wouldn't it? All right. If I'm talking about something like, okay, what is the best TV of 2019? And that's just for a 2-minute segment of a 30-minute show. And I say, okay, I believe the best TV is this for these reasons. Google will probably do something with that. And it will say, right, okay, you search for this keyword. Here's a podcast from Mark. Go and listen in the search results pages right inside your browser, in the search results page. Go and listen to minute 3 to minute 3:30 of this episode and get what you need from it. Now, that also potentially gives the industry a behavioral shift. What it does is it allows people to not necessarily need to subscribe to the show. Okay, sure, it'd be wonderful if they did, and it'd be great if they fired up their podcast app, and Google are doing a lot of cross-device work as well. So if you're listening to something on your browser and you're signed into Google, it will know on your device that you are listening to that podcast and it will pick it up. It would be wonderful if people subscribed and they were like, oh, okay, this is really good content. I'm going to keep listening to this show. But they may not, because Google are serving this up as a search result. It's very, very possible that people are going to listen to one episode and then never come back. It's also highly possible that in the future they're going to listen to a snippet of an episode and never go any further than that. We simply don't know, but we've got to look at what YouTube is doing. Got to look at what YouTube is doing in context of the wider picture of Google, and suddenly you start to see maybe this is what's going to happen. Maybe if you think about how we behave as searchers, maybe when we're searching for something, this is all right. And that is a big shift for the podcasting industry. I know a lot of podcasters, a lot of brands in podcasting aren't going to like that, but listeners might do. And I'm not talking about podcast listeners who listen to podcasts avidly. I'm talking about my dad who wants to search for what is the best TV. And if he hears someone that is theoretically served up by Google as the best value and the highest quality of opinion and the best resource in the industry, say that the LG or the Samsung or the Sony TV is the best one, he would be happy listening to that 30 seconds just to get that answer. And then it's up to us as the host and the creator to do enough to keep people engaged. So it's a really interesting scenario that we find ourselves in. It's a hugely interesting scenario that we find ourselves in, because we could find ourselves with the ability to do strong strategic keyword research and give even better content to people, which can be discovered in ways that we've never had before as podcasters. So it's exciting. It's kind of worrying as well, because I can see a lot of crappy companies popping up saying that we will SEO your podcast for you at this amount per keyword or this amount per month. I can see lots of crappy businesses popping up like that and being very naughty with podcasters. I can also see plenty of other kind of VC money coming into the space on this basis. Max out on Google. We're the number one Google Analytics platform for podcasts. Fine. That's going to happen. It is what it is. But I think as a creator, I would just keep an eye on this, all right? Because I think forget Spotify, whilst I think they're doing wonderful work and I do think there will be a mass force, I think this is right now the most exciting thing in podcast discoverability. I do believe that Apple will respond this year. I don't think we need to kind of chastise them for being quote-unquote lazy or quote-unquote behind. I don't think we need to do that. I think they are working on something very high quality, and I think this year, by the end of 2019, the whole landscape will look very, very different, with the big three, Google, Spotify and Apple Podcasts, having done quite a lot in this space this year. I think we're going to see that by the end of the year. And then, of course, Pandora and the other players that are out there as well, starting to get into the space a little bit more. So it's an exciting time, but just be mindful of that when it comes to Google. It's an opportunity that you can get on early. All right, start to look at keyword research for your shows. What's ranking well for the stuff that you talk about that isn't a podcast? All right, what is ranking well that in your niche, in your episode, that isn't a podcast? What could people search for to get to this episode? Okay, do some keyword research. Let's start to play with that a little bit. So thank you so much for joining me here on the Podcast Accelerator. This is a bonus episode, so we're back to normal tomorrow. We're continuing talking about podcast rebranding. And please, if you enjoy the show and you know people that are in podcasting, please remember to tell your friends that the show is available to listen to for free in any app that supports podcasting. And if you're wondering what is the best next step for my show and for my podcast, whether you're a new podcaster or a veteran, go ahead and spend 5 minutes taking our short survey, where I'm going to help you to go through a couple of questions that are going to identify which of the major podcasting problems are holding you back from growing or just succeeding in your show as you expect to, all right? I'm also going to give you access to our Vibrant Podcast Rebellion community, our weekly free group coaching, actionable and insider-only emails, and even a free invitation to the Podcast Success Academy. So go ahead and invest that 5 minutes in yourself and in your podcast, and let's figure out how you can grow further by heading to rebelbasemedia.io/grow. And until the next time, thank you so much for joining me. A big shout out to some friends of mine, Evo Terra, the guys out there, Daniel J. Lewis, who are putting out wonderful content right now in the podcasting world as we continue to see this speed up and the inevitable growth in the industry just be perpetual. Just day on day, it's just becoming crazier and crazier. So great work, Evo, great work, Daniel, great work, James Criddle, and all the guys out there covering this. It's fantastic stuff. And until next time, never forget, the more you expect from yourself, the more you will excel.